some people have tried to compare the the issues facing William Ruto and those that faced our first vice president, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. Uh, and people tend to create parallels, especially those who called for William Ruto to also resign, which is actually what Jaramogi did. And I just want to say that there are certain differences in these two leaders and the political predicaments that they face, uh, that I think made Ruto not to resign, but which made Jaramogi to resign. So the first thing is that William Ruto is not Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. William Ruto might not even admire Jaramogi Oginga Odinga's principled politics. And because of that, William Ruto will not, follow in the footsteps of Oginga Odinga, whom I think was one of the best leaders, the best presidents that Kenya lost in its struggle, in its war with itself. So Jaramogi, you'll recall, exited Kenyatta government at the very early stages. So that is the first difference between William Ruto and Jaramogi, that Jaramogi left government very early. He realized very early that Kenyatta was up to no good, that Kenyatta will not change the country, that Kenyatta had reneged on the independence promise of, empowering the African, and he didn't want to be part of it from the very beginning. So he started increasingly looking out of government at the very early stage. It's like because Kenyatta forms government in 1963. There's independence, and then in 1964 there's a republic, and so Kenyatta becomes president and Jaramogi becomes vice president. And thereafter, remember, there was no assistant prime minister, but Kenyatta actually became a prime minister. But thereafter, there were certain things that Jaramogi and that independence era generation had agreed to pursue. And so what happens is that as Kenyatta increasingly deviated from these things, they had a difference, and their first difference was not on whether Jaramogi wanted to succeed Kenyatta, and you don't do that just 2 years into the presidency of your senior, your boss. But the differences between Jaramogi and Kenyatta, and which have been historically recorded, nobody has ever said that those differences were as a result of succession. In fact, when we read our history, the only time people discuss Kenyatta's succession was when Kenyatta is dead, when Kenyatta is abruptly dead in Mombasa, and suddenly the issue of whether Daniel Toroitich arap Moi, who was the vice president then, should replace him, become an issue. Throughout Kenyatta's life, that discussion of transition or of succession from Kenyatta to the next leader was never publicly, never really became a public issue, something that was publicly debated. So why did what were these issues? What were these issues of principle that one would say Jaramogi differed with Kenyatta on? And the one that is most known is the Kikuyu land question, which I find curious, because no leader right now, for instance, who comes from a different ethnic group, will really care over that issue. The Luo, Jaramogi's tribesmen, did not have a land issue. They didn't have a landless issue. White people did not, in their numbers, did not displace, for instance, Luos. So there was no land problem in Luo Nyanza, and Luos did not, for instance, support independence because they had a land grievance against the British or against the colonial powers. But Kikuyus did, or generally Mount Kenya, what used to be called Kem, they did. They had a land grievance. In fact, one of the reasons that they had sent Jomo Kenyatta to Europe was because of land issues in the Kikuyu country then. So when independence comes and Jaramogi insists that, this was a bargain, this was a pledge, this was a promise we made to these poor people that we will be fair in their resettlement. But remember, what happens is that the Kenyatta elites begin land grabbing, That is when this, agrarian kleptocracy begins, and Jaramogi differs essentially with that. The second issue that Jaramogi differed with Kenyatta and his cohorts was, the increasingly powerful place that the British was still occupying in Kenyan society, even though we had what other people have called paper independence. So Kenya claimed to be non-aligned. It will neither be pro-West or pro-East. It was going to be an African country that would adopt the best from whichever part of the world, but will contextualize them with the realities of life as lived in Kenya. But increasingly, Kenya faced the West. There was still a lot of Western interest in the country, and Jomo Kenyatta, and then did a lot, to ensure that those Western interests were taken care of. And I think that, if you ask me, I think it was wise in that sense, because then Kenya became a very, stable and economically prosperous, country in those early years. The question would be, who prospered? If Kenya became a prosperous country because of, the country's decision, or Jomo Kenyatta and his group's decision to embrace the West, embrace Britain, and embrace the United States, generally embrace the Western world. And if that led to prosperity, who prospered? That is the question that people never ask themselves. But that I think is part of the things that were in Jaramogi's mind, that, okay, we are creating this new egalitarian society, we are creating this new wealth, but who is benefiting from it? Because sorts of our people are still poor, they are still squatters, they still don't have land, they still don't have, the economic resources to, enjoy, the plenty that Kenya, promised to offer, or that independence promised to offer. And so that question of to what extent should Kenya be, should Kenya face the West? To what extent should British interests and American interests, be paramount in Kenya's politics and economics and social life? That disturbed Jaramogi, and they didn't agree much. And it said that a lot of anti-Jaramogi, problems were then created, not even by Kenyatta himself, but by the British, who felt that Jaramogi, was against their interests. And they allied with Kenyatta, somebody they had called just, a few years ago, just 4 or 5 years ago, as a leader into darkness and destruction, if you look at the way the British defined the Kikuyu or the Mau Mau, for instance, you wouldn't believe it. But again, this is now the leader that they embraced. The other thing you have to think about was the kind of society Jaramogi wanted to build. And again, I think that here there was also a big problem, because Jaramogi believed in the honesty and the decency of the African. He didn't see the kind of, manipulation that some African leaders had been subjected to by the British. So he, for instance, advocated for a single party, and was one of the early supporters of KADU joining KANU, to form one united African front. But that killed him, because when the leaders of KANU joined KANU, they tended to, increasingly, these were the most moderate group, the most pro-Western group. So they tended to increasingly shape government policy in such a way that it would support, the interests of the former colonialists. So there was a disagreement there. The third disagreement between Jaramogi and Kenyatta was the new country that was evolving, the corruption and crony capitalism that was evolving under Kenyatta, and which was benefiting just a small clique of people. Many who were Kenyatta's, home guards, Kenyatta's tribesmen, and majority of those tribesmen actually were also just children of home guards, people who had benefited from colonialism, and increasingly the people who had fought colonialism were losing out again. So that society also led to the differences, the major differences between Jaramogi and Kenyatta. And then in all those differences, one thing that Africans, or that we always forget, is that there was also, in the global context, what came to be referred to as the Cold War. And because of that, and the Cold War would, start in the 60s, and it will go up to, up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the Western world did a lot to ensure that most African countries did not, look to the East. The economic system of the East, what they call communism, was sold to Africans as evil, even though most Africans did not know. And up to now, you see people who just, throw that word, that, Jaramogi was a communist, or he was a communist sympathizer, without putting a context into that, a very loaded statement. So what then happens is that because of that Cold War environment and the Cold War propaganda, leaders who opposed, or who are seen to not, support Western domination of the world, were just branded communists. So in Kenya, Jaramogi is branded a communist. Remember, in Tanzania, the Nyerere government then, even though had a lot of British influence, had adopted what an African version of communism, which they refer to as Ujamaa, or Tanzanian socialism, a homegrown socialism in Tanzania. If you look to Uganda, there are also issues there, So between 1963 and 1989, there was a lot of Cold War propaganda, and the leaders who were then seen to support an unaligned, the true unaligned vision for Kenya, were seen essentially to oppose the West, and a lot was done to destroy them. A lot of propaganda was put on their reputations, and they lost out by and large. Yeah, but when you look at William Ruto on the other end and his fallout with Uhuru Kenyatta, the first thing you realize is that this fallout happens very late. William Ruto had faithfully served under Uhuru Kenyatta's government has faithfully served under Uhuru Kenyatta's government for 9 years. He's been a government official for 9 years. Jaramogi was only a government official of the rank of William Ruto for 1 year, just 1 year, So even the ability to accumulate, I see people referring to Jaramogi as dynasty, or the Odinga family as dynasty. What constitutes a dynasty, for instance? Even the ability to accumulate, that will then make somebody a dynasty. William Ruto has had the experience. He's now served in government for close to 30 years in different capacities. Jaramogi's total service in government whether as MP or as vice president, is less than 4 years. Let that sink in. It's less than 4 years. Because Jaramogi is, once he resigns from government and joins or forms KPU, he effectively becomes a pariah. He becomes an opposition leader, antagonistic to the government of the day, and they do all they can to destroy him. And that runs up to, in 69. So from 65 to 69, Jaramogi is in opposition, and is in a terrible position because he's opposing a government that is doing everything to destroy him, supported by the West. And then in 69, KPU is proscribed. It's declared an illegal organization. So Jaramogi is taken to detention and then to house arrest. And he stays in political cold up to 1992 with the reintroduction of multi-party politics. So when he returns to government or to politics, a whole generation, most of the people he had fought independence with, majority had died. Many of them had died. Those who had remained are now very powerful. And remember that when President Moi takes power in 79, he tries to rehabilitate Jaramogi. But Jaramogi, being Jaramogi, still insists that certain things that Kenyatta did were wrong. And Moi, remember, had decided to follow the footsteps of Jomo Kenyatta and spent almost the entirety of his presidency, trying to, appeal to Kikuyus, or trying to, make himself, palatable to the Kikuyu community. So Moi spent a lot of time, what one would say, ass licking or ass kissing the Kikuyus. Moi had, of all his vice presidents, a majority were Kikuyus, and they served for many years. Many years. Kibaki himself served for like 11 years as Moi's DP. He also had Murumbi, he also had Karanja. So you have to put all that into context. Even Saitoti, people say that Saitoti may have been a Kikuyu. Nobody knows. The only other person, especially running or deputies from Western Kenya, the only person Moi picked was Mudavadi, who served for some months and lost an election. So if you look at Moi's presidency, it was fairly dominated by the fear of the Kikuyu. So he did everything he could to compensate and assuage, the fears of the Kikuyu political class. So Jaramogi finds himself, out of government for that long, up to 1992, and he doesn't win the election of 1992. They form Ford splits. He loses. Actually, he didn't come even second. The person who came second was Matiba. He only became leader of opposition because his Ford Kenya party had more MPs than Matiba's party and Kibaki's party. And remember that at some point he even lost that position as opposition leader when Kibaki's party then became the dominant political party. So he lost being the leader of opposition then. So William Ruto could not play that high principled politics where you maintain that we are going into government. Nobody knows, for instance, in 2013, what William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta agreed in principle, to achieve for Kenya. And there was no fallout. For 5 years, there was no fallout. There was not even a disagreement on the projects that were being implemented, the economic policy that Jubilee was pursuing. There was no fallout at all. The corruption that began to engulf government immediately Jubilee won, there was no fallout at all. The exclusion of other ethnic groups from government that Jubilee perfected immediately. It got to power. Again, there was no fallout at all. So the fallout between Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto is only on one thing, that Uhuru Kenyatta has refused to endorse William Ruto as his successor. That is the only issue. That is the only time that you now see this fallout, starting. That is the first time, and it comes in March 2018, beginning March 2018, after the handshake. That is when you begin to see William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta, their political relationship collapsing. All along, they saw everything using the same lens, or in the same lens. So to compare and to contrast William Ruto and Jaramogi is, to at least to fetch it from a bit too far. These are two leaders whose politics were completely different, whose visions for the country were completely different. Jaramogi, for instance, was not a primitive accumulator like William Ruto. So he didn't become wealthy by stealing from government or by being in government. Jaramogi started out as a very wealthy man. That's also a fact, that in the early years of independence, or in the early years of the struggle for independence, between 1956 to 1963, Jaramogi was perhaps richer than any Kikuyu man alive. Let that sink in. Jaramogi was perhaps richer than any Kikuyu man alive. And it is Jaramogi's resources, by and large, that was bankrolling KANU, and that bankrolled, in a larger sense, the 1963 elections that KANU then defeated. Because Kenyatta then, beginning 52, after the Mau Mau uprising, Kenyatta is taken into detention, and a lot of organizing for KANU falls on the shoulders, and also organizing for African independence and African rule falls on the shoulders of Jaramogi. So he uses a lot of his resources. This is a guy who was, had founded the Luo Thrift and Trading Company, and one of the most successful trading entities in the 1950s and 1960s. So if you look at that, one would say that actually government service, impoverished Jaramogi, while for Ruto it is government service that made him a wealthy man. So these are people who looked at accumulation from two different angles, and up to now, even those who oppose Jaramogi do not call him a primitive accumulator. Nobody can say that Jaramogi took this from this ministry, or took this, or owned this and he got it when he was serving in government. So a lot of that depended very much on why, for instance, Jaramogi and Kenyatta differed. So I always want those of us and my generation of people who are looking at politics to also just think for themselves. If somebody is called a capitalist, why is he a capitalist? If somebody is branded a communist, would you support why you brand him a communist? Such things, so that we use these labels very cautiously, because the next day you will be called a tribalist, or you will be called a whatever. So that is actually what happened. So William Ruto and Jaramogi Odinga are two completely different politicians, and their eventual end it may also be completely different. But let's see how it turns out, because William Ruto is still alive.